Oh, what a headline this week. Literally a headline. The headlines said, hey, beware melatonin, because melatonin is the quote unquote scientific paper said is linked to an increased risk of heart failure, which of course makes people want to take their melatonin supplement and hurl it out the window or throw it in the trash or any number of other things. But in fact, it's time, Catherine, for you and I to cut through the panic, allow people to continue to sleep despite their anxiety over the recent headline. And let's make sense of this for people, because it really isn't the case, as I read what was behind the headlines. It doesn't seem like the headlines really were justified saying, if you take melatonin, you're going to get heart failure. So what do you think? Listen, this is very much in your lane as a PhD. And so tell us what you think about that.
It was very much in my lane because I take melatonin, as you know, in our For Great Sleep, a
Yes.
supplement. And so, which by the way, can be found at forvitahealth.com. But yes, I was shocked, as many people were. I don't know how many calls you got, but I got a lot of calls asking, should I stop taking this? And it was a dramatic headline to a not so dramatic study. As a matter of fact, this study was published at a conference called the American Heart Association Conference, huge conference, lots of incredible research presented there. But these abstracts are not peer reviewed. And so it means that everybody submits the data, but nobody reviews it. And so when a headline that like this hits from such a large conference, it can make a huge impact. But let's talk a little bit about the study. And I think we should really discuss the elements of the study, because that's where I think we can kind of debunk some of these headlines that came out. What do you think?
I think that makes total sense because, listen, I'm not a biochemist, right? I am not a nutritional biochemist, as you are. I don't have a PhD, I have an MD. But I can tell you this, I was kind of right away taken aback by the fact that the short abstract, the non-peer reviewed material that generated the headline was about people who were prescribed melatonin. Now, I've never met anybody who's prescribed melatonin. People that I know buy it. Sometimes they buy it in the form of or as an ingredient in For Great Sleep, for vitahealth.com. And we're very proud of it, and people get great results. So can you take us inside how you came to understand, oh, okay, now that I've looked at it, no alarm bells are really going off, and the reasoning behind that?
Yeah, so when you look at the study, what they did was they took a very large database. In fact, the database that they used was one I used for a lot of the studies I would do when I was in pharma. It's a good database, but you have to know how to use it properly. They looked at 130,000 people in the UK and in the US. These people had to have, in the UK, a diagnosis of insomnia, which, let's get this straight, our supplement is not for insomnia. It's for people who have, sleep issues, but not insomnia. And what they did is they divided them basically into two groups: people in the US, people outside the US, two different groups of people, comparing apples to oranges. And then they said, well, let's look at what their heart failure rates were. And they found that their heart failure rates were 90% higher in the people that used melatonin. Now, it's not very often that you find a study where you have a 90% increase in everything. So I looked and then I
That's
said,
remarkable.
that just doesn't look right. So that was the first thing that I said, nah, there's something wrong with the data. I went on to look at it, and, not just myself, but sleep specialists across the US have also commented on this, that the study, not peer reviewed. As a matter of fact, in their abstract, Dr. Abloh, they do not even disclose any financial arrangements, which is really odd. So I think just those two things in general. But then as you dig deeper, and we can talk about this, there are other parts of the study comparing apples to oranges, kind of the headline scaring people. Maybe the abstract wasn't supposed to, but it certainly did. So those were the two things that really raised my brow with the study.
Well, so first of all, being diagnosed with a quote sleep disorder called insomnia rather than just saying, hey, I have trouble falling or staying asleep, that's a different group of people. Secondly, they're prescribed in many of these cases melatonin to deal with this sleep diagnosis, insomnia. And there is nowhere in this study that says, well, the melatonin caused it. Definitely caused the heart failure. It could well be that there's any number of other factors that folks who end up being, quote, prescribed melatonin have other factors that are weighing in that lead them to experience heart failure. For instance, you could have shortness of breath. You could have any number of things that lead you to wake up in the middle of the night or have difficulty getting back to sleep or falling asleep. They don't control for all of those variables in this study, not all of them. And so basically what they're saying is, well, melatonin was on the scene of the crime. And that would be like saying, well, okay, there are doorbells on every house where someone dies in their house. It must be the doorbell. No, we got to look deeper into why else. Maybe it's the cyanide that's inside. So it's present, but in no way did they say, well, now we see that it caused this. It may well be that 130,000 people, for whatever reason, were using melatonin and also at risk for heart failure for very different reasons.
That's such a great point. And we know from meta-analysis, which are really the top of the heap when you look at the validity of data, and we know from meta-analyses that short sleep duration increases your risk of coronary artery disease. So people who are taking
Hmm.
melatonin to help them sleep may actually, and there's some data to support this, be helping themselves. So this conflicting data has everybody flipped on their head, so to speak.
Well, and as I understand it, this runs in an opposite direction from existing data that suggested that melatonin would be helpful for cardiac health. What about that? Am I wrong about that? Or isn't this sort of a counter current claim, if you will?
So there is a study, again, another meta-analysis that provided evidence that melatonin can actually, I don't want to say prevent, but maybe reduce the risk of heart failure. And they have solid data. Again, meta-analysis, very strong data that show that it can improve quality of life and improve what's called the New York Heart Association functional class, which is just a way to measure how the heart is doing, essentially using a bunch of different variables. And melatonin actually improved that, and it improved their ejection fraction.
Hmm.
So, and the ejection fraction is the amount of blood that's going through your heart, essentially. That's very positive for melatonin.
Yeah, the ejection fraction, as somebody who knows a little bit about heart failure, that's like what you're looking at, one of the very substantial measures that you're looking at to say, how is this patient doing? Ejection fraction. You have blood in the heart, the ventricle of the heart squeezes down to pump that blood to the body. What percentage of the blood in the heart is being ejected to the body? You don't want that ejection fraction to keep falling because then you can't feed your system the blood that it really needs. The blood is remaining in the heart. That's a problem too because you can get clotting and all kinds of other things. But the fact that melatonin can increase ejection fraction and the fact that it can be in other studies considered to be heart protective or heart healthy suggests somebody hung up their abstract at the meeting, put up their poster with the thumbtacks, and it's a headline like, listen, I've worked in the media a long time. That's a nice headline to put out there. It's going to get carried by a lot of different press. One thing that does worry me, I don't want to be like a paranoid conspiracy theorist or anything like that. I'm just going to say it sort of worries me. I don't know who funded this research. Is the fact that they didn't disclose that, meaning, well, it was all, I don't know, we went in our piggy banks and we did it ourselves? I don't think so. But I do worry because we keep hearing like all these negative things about blockbuster supplements. I like to think of 4 Great Sleep, which you can get at 4 Vita Health. I like to think of it as a bit of a blockbuster supplement. And the fact that they're going after melatonin, they used to go after vitamin D too, a lot. Then all the data came rolling in that, man, you gotta have enough vitamin D in your system. And if you're not getting it from food, please take a supplement. It seems awfully convenient that there are medicines used for improving sleep, which tons of people get who don't qualify for a medical sleeplessness or insomnia diagnosis. It's just like, I can't sleep, doc. Here's some of this written out as a prescription. It does seem convenient that melatonin would be under attack as one of the top supplements used by people voting with their feet who say, I feel better, I'm sleeping better. There are some studies that suggest maybe it has an anti-malignancy kind of
Yeah.
factor to it. And so I don't know. I'd really want to know who funded this study. It better not be, I don't know, better not be. But if you learned it was folks who make either, an over-the-counter branded sleep aid that doesn't contain melatonin, or if it's a pharmaceutical company funding this who makes, I don't know, Ambien or something, whatever. I don't know that. I'm just
Yeah.
guessing. It's wondering. Then you'd say, well, it sounds like a little convenient here.
Yeah, I think the only way we'll find out is if they come out and disclose it, or if it does go through a peer review process and is published as data in a peer review journal where the disclosures are required. Now, I want to give them a little bit of benefit of a doubt here. Maybe they submitted this abstract and at the time they didn't have financial disclosures and Jay doesn't require it. So, they didn't. Maybe once it's published, they will. But it would be great if they came out and said, this study was funded by so and so. The other thing, though, that is interesting about this, it was done at Columbia, and we know there's good doctors there, there's good researchers there. So I do find it odd that they didn't disclose all this or that the university didn't require them to disclose it because typically the university will require that.
Absolutely.
But,
And,
you were, oh, go ahead.
no, go on. No, you go.
The other thing, because you mentioned anti-cancer properties, melatonin also acts as an antioxidant, so it can shield cells from the stress that we have. So, that's another positive thing about it, and calm the inflammation and help support recovery of patients who have undergone surgeries.
Well, right. And if you take melatonin, according to at least one study, and these aren't conclusions, they are hints, but if you receive melatonin 10 milligrams before cardiac surgery, you tend to have better dilation of your blood vessels, improved heart function, and reduced fatigue. And so that suggests, and also lower infarct size. So if you have a heart attack, the size of the damaged tissue, the area is likely to be less. So again, there are a lot of data points, and I wouldn't advise people right now to just throw away a supplement if it is helping them regulate their sleep. And if they tend to get not enough sleep, and this has been, as it is for many people, a godsend. Otherwise, you'd have them thrown away in some cases if you looked at research in isolation, especially abstracts, especially non-peer reviewed research. You'd have them thrown away their vitamin D. They'd say vitamin C, no, not useless, as they used to say. Mind not that there are lots of studies that now back up Linus Pauling and say, listen, maybe IV vitamin C could be helpful to you. If you're facing really serious illnesses, it might even be helpful. I'm a little dubious about the abstract here, for sure.
And being the crime writer that you are, I'm sure that you've studied many things like this. But can we also talk a little bit more about why potentially higher doses of melatonin can help? And one of them is because the half-life of melatonin is 30 to 60 minutes. So that's the amount of time that it takes for half of the compound of the melatonin to go away. And so for a 10 milligram dose, it maintains those levels that we need, sustained levels, for 6 to 8 hours. In
Right.
addition, it has stronger antioxidant support because those higher concentrations are more protective, and they help neutralize the things in our bodies called free radicals that support vascular health as well as mitochondrial health. And mitochondrial health is so important. And then the last thing I think that's important is we know that cortisol levels around, if they peak at around 3 a.m., you can actually wake up during that time because your cortisol is spiking. And so it's believed that the steady state that melatonin higher doses have can help those stress hormones calm down so you don't get those 3 a.m. wake ups. Does that make sense to you?
That makes sense to me. Absolutely. Also,
Yeah.
we know that as you age, your melatonin levels, your natural melatonin levels tend to drop, and that a 10 milligram dose can help restore your melatonin levels toward youthful levels. And so we've got lots of reason to consider 10 milligrams of melatonin to be not only a tolerable dose, but perhaps a very beneficial dose. And it will allow for the metabolites of melatonin, the breakdown products of melatonin, to be present at sufficient levels, and these are antioxidants, that they can actually do their work. They have funky names like AFMK and AMK, but in any case, I really think that it can, as you said, reduce cortisol so that you don't get stress hormone spikes. It can deal with free radicals, which are charged molecules that travel around the body and can damage things. And so that's what an antioxidant is. So it can create higher levels of that. And again, if you take enough of it, you're going to get at least the breakdown products will be sufficient. The amount in your bloodstream will be sufficient as it's broken down throughout a 6 to 8 hour period. So using just a little bit may not be enough.
Yeah, it may not be, especially because as we age, we actually lose some melatonin, we produce less melatonin. And so perhaps a higher dose, and they've studied up to 50 milligrams and showed good tolerance and no issues of dependency. And that was in humans that they studied that, not animals. So more evidence, that potentially a higher dose can be helpful.
Yeah.
I also think that it's important, not just the melatonin, but there's other things that are in for great sleep, for example, that are added to melatonin that help with the other signals in our body to help us sleep. In addition to that, there are habits that we know and we've talked about, like making sure your room is cool, making sure you have a dark room. Don't drink caffeine unless you have a very high tolerance for it before after 2 in the afternoon, and avoid alcohol late because that can also keep you awake.
That's definitely true. And for the researchers who pursued it, hung up their abstract or poster, whatever it was at the meeting, and generate a lot of headlines, that can feel good. Everybody likes a little bit of attention, but myself included. But I will say this, that you got to be careful, because I think about all the people who missed out on taking vitamin D supplements during their life, and now it's seen as pretty critical to do that, at least to know your vitamin D level and to supplement if your level is low. And so if people are throwing out their melatonin, they may be throwing away an opportunity to actually improve their heart health and an opportunity to sleep well, improve their daytime alertness, improve their focus, improve their relationships, because not sleeping is just not an option. It's going to exact a toll, a real toll.
Yes. And as I've heard you say before, that good sleep especially, isn't a luxury. And in this
That's
case, as
true.
we're talking about the heart, that's obviously it's the vital muscle that we have. Perhaps melatonin protects the heart at night.
We really don't, we can't say definitively. And based on this quote unquote study, I'd say we really need it peer reviewed. What does that mean, by the way? I mean, what it means is that you have esteemed scientists look at it and think about, well, what about this study design? What about your conclusions? What about the results that you have drawn, or the conclusions you've drawn from the data? What about the data? How good is the data? Why are these people who got prescriptions? Why didn't you just do it on people who reported, hey, I use it? Why didn't you have people take it and then figure out over time, over the next 5 years, what happens to their hearts? That would be an interesting study to say, listen, we're going to recruit people with trouble sleeping, not a diagnosed condition of insomnia, which requires other factors be present. But you're having trouble sleeping. We're going to recruit you into this study under certain conditions, and we're going to give you 10 milligrams of melatonin. We're going to see what happens to you over the next 5 years. That's the gold standard study, not, oh, we looked at people prescribed melatonin in the UK. And look what happened. We saw that those folks who were prescribed it have more heart trouble. Well, yeah, but why? We're still in search of why. And just like I said, you could have people who have doorbells. Everybody who's murdered in a house, there's a doorbell. Must be the doorbell that did it. Has to be. Well, no, that's a flawed conclusion.
Yeah, that would be a flawed conclusion. And Dr. Abloh, I don't know if you know this, but I've submitted abstracts to meetings like this and also many articles to the peer review process. There's a huge difference between an abstract and the final publication. And I've had articles rejected because they said, no, we don't like the way you did this study design. So, when you do these types of things, it's always a risk, but the peer review process helps to ensure that the data has been read by experts, studied by experts, and they think it deserves publication.
So how would we sum up? I think what we would sum up is to say, listen, there's a bit of data that's come out that is not peer reviewed, meaning it hasn't been fully checked out. It's an abstract that reporters ran with saying, hey, melatonin, it seems like it causes heart failure. But in fact, that statement bears a ton of scrutiny still. And there is countervailing data suggesting that getting enough sleep is healthy for your heart, that melatonin itself may be healthy for your physiology and for your heart in a number of ways. And we are not at present convinced by the abstract, the poster hung up at the meeting, that this is some kind of death nail. Far from it in the use of melatonin. And frankly, we're concerned that it seems like, not to be conspiracy theorists, but they keep coming for the supplements that work. And if they can kill off all the supplements that work, there's only prescription medication left. And that fits rather neatly into the profit motive of pharmaceutical companies. I don't hate those folks, but then again, it's worth thinking about motivation. We got to find out who funded this study, a little bit of investigative journalism. We write about things like this at feelamazingdaily.com, not just about sleep, but many health topics. And if you are looking for a good night's sleep, look no further than forvitahealth.com.
This program is for educational and informational purposes only and is not medical advice. Consult a healthcare provider before adding supplements to your diet. These statements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration. The products discussed are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease.